Maybe you think you've seen enough mountain climbing documentaries for a while. I'd urge you to set aside that bias and make time for Lucy Walker's new film, Mountain Queen. I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. Lucy Walker has been making documentaries for over 30 years. Many of them stand among the best of the field. Devil's Playground is about Amish teenagers exploring outside their community for a year. Wasteland is about the artist Vic Muniz collaborating with garbage scavengers in Brazil. The Crash Reel is about snowboarder Kevin Pierce coming to terms with a brain injury. Lucy's latest is among the best of her work. Mountain Queen, the Summits of Lhakpa Sherpa, profiles a woman from Nepal. When we meet her, she's climbed to the top of Mount Everest 9 times. And that's not even the most impressive thing about Lhakpa Sherpa. She grew up in a remote village without learning to read or write. She broke a deep local prejudice that held women back from climbing. She married a Romanian climber named George and emigrated to the United States. But her husband was violent and abusive. Lhakpa had to escape. The film begins in 2022, when she's living in Hartford, Connecticut, raising her 2 teenage daughters, named Sunny and Shiny, on her own. Lhakpa works the only jobs available to her, cleaning houses and washing dishes at Whole Foods. Now in her late 40s, she decides she wants to climb Everest for her 10th time. She hopes that somehow it could improve life for her daughters. When Lucy started following Lhakpa, no one could anticipate what would unfold on camera. I first saw a rough cut last summer and invited it to play at the Toronto International Film Festival. Last week, it was released on Netflix. This isn't Lucy's first film about climbing Mount Everest. Back in 2006, her second documentary called Blindsight premiered in Toronto. That film follows a blind American mountain climber as he leads an expedition of blind Tibetan children on Everest. Currently, the film isn't available on any streaming platform, but I'm hoping the success of Mountain Queen will help bring Blindsight back into distribution. I sat down with Lucy in New York City, where the Paris Theater is holding a retrospective of her work. We go deep into talking about Mountain Queen, but I started by asking about Blindsight, that she had just watched for the first time in 19 years.
Thanks for bringing it up, because I love this film and it's not been available to stream, although I'm really hoping to change that, because I just looked at it again in the retrospective. I'm like, why is this not available? It's such a compelling movie and it doesn't look dated, and even the video quality really holds up. We shot it in 2004 and that video quality is kind of passable on a big screen blown up, whereas my 2002 film that I'd shot like 1999 to 2002 looks pretty crunchy on a big screen these days to our modern, contemporary eyes. But so Blindsight was a film that premiered at Toronto Film Festival in 2006. Thank you, Tom, for that. That was incredible. And it's about an amazing American blind climber named Eric Weinmeyer, who lives in Colorado. And he is the first blind person to summit Mount Everest. And we see a little of that expedition, but that's not all. What then happens is there is a blind school, the first, only, and now sadly not even here any longer, blind school in Lhasa, Tibet, which is run by this extraordinary blind German woman, Sabria Tenberken. And Sabria learned as a teenager that there was no Tibetan Braille and no blind school in Tibet. So she personally, she's so intrepid that people actually didn't realize when reviewing the movie that she was actually fully blind, because she rides horseback alone around Tibet. And so she rode horseback alone around Tibet to find the blind kids, because there were so many, and it's got the highest per capita blindness in the world because of the UV radiation and the dung they burn for fuel, which irritates the eyes and causes infection and so forth. And so she went and found all these amazing blind kids and set up the first blind school and invented Tibetan Braille. And it was a real struggle, because in Tibet there was some kind of folklore that really lent people to be very biased against blind people. They'd done something wrong in a previous life. They were devils or demons or bad luck, or they really had a tough time, people with disabilities at that time in Tibet. And so the school was like a lifesaver, and it was just pure joy place. But she was really struggling to instill confidence in the kids. So when Eric summited Mount Everest, which is half in Tibet, she had the kids write to him and say, "You have changed everything. You have shown what blind people are capable of. In Tibet, climbing Mount Everest as a blind person is really getting their attention. And thank you, because life's been really tough for us." And Eric was so moved. He thought, well, look, I'm a white, privileged, rich guy. I can climb a mountain, but what if they could climb their own mountain? I want to help them achieve their own summit. And so he went back to Tibet with his same incredible team of mountain climbers that had guided him up to Everest, and said, we're going to go back to Everest and we're going to take 6 of the most strong Tibetan blind students with us. And we're not going to go to the top of Mount Everest. We're going to climb a peak of Everest that's kind of next to it on the north side called Lhakpa, coincidentally called Lhakpa, because, of course, my new film, Mountain Queen, is about this amazing woman called Lhakpa Sherpa. Lhakpa just means actually Wednesday in Tibetan, and Sherpa is a dialect of Tibetan. So Wednesday mountain, you could say. But anyway, we're going to climb this mountain. 23,000 feet, by the way, it's not as tall as Mount Everest, which is 29,000 feet. But you're in the death zone past 18. I mean, this is the death zone. It is no joke. It was 1 degree Fahrenheit. I mean, that's the daytime temperature. The nighttime, I don't think anyone had, you couldn't even measure it because we were too cold to measure it. You know, it was awful.
And so you got enlisted,
yes.
How?
I was approached by a producer who then left the project and said, do you think there's anything about Eric going that's interesting? And I said, yes, absolutely, and here's how I want to do it. And I was really, really interested because I was, a lot of my career is explained by places I want to visit, and I'm broke, so wanted to visit Tibet. I was absolutely fascinated. But also I had a particular connection, I suppose, with blindness because I happen to actually be blind in my right eye and have had amazing medical care since birth. That means I can see really, really well. My other eye corrects really well, even though actually it's also got a huge amount of problems. They just are really well controlled. And so but for the grace of God, the kids in the blind school in Tibet had better vision than me inherently. I was really acutely aware of that. And also just, maybe even if I'd had perfect vision, I would have. I felt how could you not have been interested in this? But I was not a climber, and it was a little bit of a challenge. And so I set off and spent months in Tibet. I almost 6 months in Tibet in 2004. And the great thing was that we did 2 climbs, and so I had sort of time to actually sort of figure out on the job how to sort of tweak it for the second climb, which is the main climb you see in the movie. And so I had this extraordinary experience of climbing Lhakpa Mountain with a blind American accomplished mountain climber, a blind German educator who was very responsible for these kids, and these 6 extraordinary blind Tibetan teenagers. And we set off, and what was interesting was that it wasn't easy at all. It was actually, in fact, really ambitious and really dangerous. And so this film, rather than being a kind of happy, yay, look, we stood on top, yay, yay, us kind of situation, there's enormous amount of tension in the movie because it was terrifying. I mean, rocks were falling, kids were getting hurt, people were crying, people were getting altitude sick. Our doctor wound up having an emergency evacuation. I mean, it was gnarly. And so the film becomes this kind of very tense nail biter with a kind of culture clash component as well, because these American guides are trying to stand on top. And the German woman and her Dutch boyfriend are we just want to have a really lovely time together, teaching the kids solidarity and singing songs. And the Tibetan kids are sort of caught up in this, and they'd come from a culture which doesn't inherently value mountain climbing. The only reason you kind of climb is either because the Western tourists are paying you to carry their stuff up a mountain, or because the yaks are really like hungry and there's no grazing down below. But generally, they'd much rather stick around at the lowest slopes possible, because that is the more comfortable place to be. And yet they'd had all this pressure piled on them by their parents. Like, you can't do anything. If you can climb a mountain, I'll finally, think of you as a son, and things like this. And so they had this it was just a really interesting setup. And I was clinging on for dear life because I felt such a responsibility. And also I'm a thoroughly mediocre, climber. And it was an incredible experience making that movie. And I got to learn how to make a film on Everest. And I didn't really have any intention of going back because I never like to repeat myself. Sort of creatively, I was like a new challenge. And also sort of personally, I really, didn't feel like altitude was something I needed to do again ever. And there are lovely mountains at lower altitudes. And I always joke that I live at sea level for a reason. I want to see the sea and then I know I'm fine. But nonetheless, when I came across the story of Lhakpa, I was like, I know how to do that. I really do. I mean, I spent months figuring out how to shoot it and then years figuring out how to edit it.
So how did that happen? So Blindsight, his film came out 18 years ago, and fast forward to 2022, and Lhakpa is going to be attempting her 10th summit of Mount Everest. As I understand it, other people have been filming with Lhakpa. This had kind of been a project that you then got brought into.
There were some other filmmakers that had. There'd been different sets of filmmakers who'd had the rights. And I first heard about Lhakpa in 2004 when something terrible happened to her on the mountain, which is sort of the centerpiece of the movie. And I was there at the time, and it was big news what happened to her. She had a near-death experience. It was a strange and striking story. And so that's when she first came on the radar. And then she second came on the radar in 2016 because there was one piece about her that scratched the surface. And it was written by a really wonderful journalist, Grayson Schaefer, in Outside Magazine. And he happened to have also done a profile of me, and he did a profile of Lhakpa. And it mentioned her divorce, and I put it together with what happened in 2004, but there were other filmmakers working on it. And they talked to me, and they didn't have any money and didn't have a plan and weren't going to shoot on Everest. And I said, look, there's a movie to be made. We've got to shoot Everest. And by the way, I made Blindsight, and I know how to do that. And they hadn't seen it, and I showed it to them. And I said, no, we can do this. And then we got the financing. And that was like almost 3 years ago. And then we climbed in 2022. And I say I did not go to the top of Mount Everest. And I knew
Your limits.
Oh, yeah. I knew that. I mean, it's, you could have this fantasy that you're going to be standing next to the DP, having a fantastic idea that's going to really, up the game of the movie. But the reality is, you're going to be throwing up in the middle of the frame, like screaming to get rescued and ruin the whole trip. So I was very conscious that there were better ways to shoot Mount Everest than me try to be there. And so that was when we had our amazing team kind of kicked in. But the first time I did go up there, and so it was understanding that, and we were going a little bit more slowly because we had these blind people with us, and that was also on the north side. You don't go up through the ice fall. On the south side and the Nepal side, which is the side we climbed in Mountain Queen, right after base camp, there's this feature called the Khumbu Icefall, which is the most dangerous and deadly part of the climb. And it's a real bottleneck, so you don't want to have a less fast climber in that patch because it's a real danger to other people.
So you come into the project, you kind of recognize that Lhakpa is going to be making this 10th climb attempt. That is something you can build a film around.
Yeah, I wouldn't say there was a project. I mean, there wasn't really the same project. There had been like a bunch of people filming and having rights, and they're amazing. And who deserves particular credit is Chris Newman, who really is a lovely filmmaker who'd really seen Lhakpa and really wanted successful Lhakpa, and I was sort of top of his list if he wasn't going to make it himself. And I think that trust that Lhakpa had in him really set me up so that when I went to meet Lhakpa and introduce myself, she was already, I think, feeling inclined that there were good filmmakers out there, but that she needed somebody who knew what they were doing and could attract funding, because that's a real challenge in our world. And her kids Googled me, and they were like, Mama, like Lucy's, a good filmmaker, and I think she could be the one to tell the story. And the kids had to Google me because Lhakpa to this day is illiterate. She was not allowed to go to school because she was a girl. In fact, she had to carry her brother to school, and she has this joke. Yeah, it's an incredible story. Yeah, she says I was a really good yellow bus, but she didn't mind because she loved being outdoors and sort of scrambling around the rocks and rivers. But she had a much younger brother, and so in order to get the cherished boy to school, the girl actually, really literally sort of accompanied him, and then when they had to cross a river or something, she'd actually pick him up and carry him. And to this day, unfortunately, she can't read or write, and it's really held her back. And so something that's an absolute mission for her is helping literacy for people from rural regions, especially girls, to get that education that she knows that would have helped her so tremendously.
So when you came into it, can you describe what Lhakpa's life was in that moment?
Yeah, Lhakpa had been washing dishes in Whole Foods and cleaning houses, and with a great attitude. I mean, I don't want to feel sorry for anybody about anything, and she always did it with great humor. She's hilarious and always got jokes, but she did describe it as like being in jail. And she used to go for a hike after work, which we see in the movie, and she'd say, "Oh, somebody bailed me out of jail," And so it isn't her happy place, although I think she's got a great graceful attitude about the dignity of work and her love of being in the United States. She's a classic hardworking immigrant in many ways, and providing for her, especially her two younger kids who are still in high school at the time. One was just graduating. And so there she was, working away, but dreaming of going back to Mount Everest. And her life's purpose had been about not just climbing mountains for fun, not at all. I mean, she climbed mountains because she had had such a tough time. She'd been subjected to so many challenges in her life, situations that had made her feel shamed and barred her from doing all the things that she loved to do, like being outdoors, being in the mountains. She had, as a girl, she had been expected to have an arranged marriage. But she didn't want to do that because she didn't want the life of her mom, which was trapped indoors. She loved nature. She loved outdoors. And she had never seen a Western tourist like everybody in her village. There'd been actually no tourism. It was a very remote area. It wasn't the kind of main Everest region where Sherpa people had been already working as climbing guides for some time. Her region was so remote that when the first Western tourists walked into her village, when she was 12 years old, her family ran away screaming, thinking that they were yetis, which are the kind of mythical monsters in that culture. And her mum even broke her arm screaming, yeti, yeti. And actually, though, they started to realize that these Westerners were friendly and, in fact, could even give them jobs if they carried these heavy, heavy loads. And Lhakpa wanted a job. She saw this as her ticket away from an arranged marriage, which was what was expected of her. And they wouldn't give her a job because she was a girl. And so even though she could throw a rock further than her cousin, and she tried to show this, the only thing that she could do to get a job was cut off her hair and pretend to be a boy, At which point she got this job as a porter, carrying 100 kilos, 220 pounds uphill for kind of weeks at a time. And she thought this was fantastic. She was on her way. She was in the mountains. She loved it. She was learning. She was getting promoted. And then she was working as a kitchen boy, where you have to work extra hard and like get up the mountain with enough time to set up the cook tent and cook dinner for the tourists before they kind of pull into the camp. And so she was unbelievable career in the trekking industry for a young teenage woman. But she then gets pregnant and is abandoned by the father. And at that time in that culture, it's like an enormous source of shame. And she was too embarrassed to go home to her family. And she kind of hid in the streets of Kathmandu, sort of a fallen woman, you might say, and determined to sort of find a way. She enters a running race. She's sort of kind of mythical fairy tale figure. She enters a running race and wins $3,000, a huge amount of money, opens a tea house. And then something happens. There's a woman who's the first Nepali woman to try to climb Mount Everest, because, believe it or not, no Nepali woman had ever managed to summit Mount Everest, even though it is in Nepal. And this one woman, Pasang Lamu Sherpa, tried and tried and tried to climb Mount Everest. And on her third attempt, tragically, she died trying, possibly summited. Many people think she'd summited, but she didn't get the official summit because she died up there, and you have to kind of return to be the sort of official first summit. So anyway, they managed to retrieve her body, which says how much they revered her in this culture for trying, but because most people that die up on Everest are sadly not recovered. But the body was brought through the streets of Kathmandu, and Lhakpa saw the body, and she had this powerful experience she describes as Pasang's soul went into her. You could sort of say perhaps it was a strong way of saying she felt inspired by her. And she realized that she was the best climber in Nepal and she could do this. But she didn't have any money. And it's extremely expensive to climb Mount Everest. And nobody was going to give her a job to climb Everest because it's the limits of physical, peak physical challenge. And even if she was a pretty great Sherpa for the best female climbing guide, she wasn't able to keep up with the men because that's just gender, differences for you. And so how was she going to do it? She spent 5 years in her tea shop begging every single one of her customers to help her write a letter to the prime minister so that she could, because she can't read or write even. She can't even write it. I want to climb Everest. I can climb Everest. People laughed at her and laughed at her and laughed at her. And she said she got more and more insistent on showing them what a woman was doing because she was really aware that this was so unfair and that she was capable of more. And she looked around and she saw that women and girls were capable of so much more in her culture than they were allowed to do. And she sort of really had this kind of like, don't get mad, get even, resilience, resourcefulness, creativity, determination, grit, you can't imagine. And finally, after 5 years, she describes this magic incident where somebody in her shop says, I won't help you write a letter to the Prime Minister, but I'm going to take you to his house right now because he's my school pal. Get in the car. And she got in the car, and the Prime Minister said, sure, let's do it. And so that became this expedition in the year 2000. And there was some filming done. There was a film made about this that doesn't feature that Lhakpa all that much. But I saw and I thought, gosh, I wonder if I could get the dailies, the raw rushes, because she's in there a little bit. And I just had a feeling the filmmakers would have filmed her more. And so she climbs, and she's the only one on the expedition who summits. And she's this unbelievable young woman. You could glimpse her in this other film. And
so was she the first Nepali woman
absolutely.
to summit
and descend? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. But that's sort of just the beginning of the story. And also the story, I think some people think the punchline is like she's climbing Everest and she works in Whole Foods. And actually that's sort of the starting point. I mean, she's really had this.
It's the easy way to describe it. Certainly I'm guilty of describing it that way because it's just so incongruous.
But you actually wrote you wrote this great synopsis that talks about her going back to Everest, to help with her daughters after a period of struggle. And I think that's the way I think about it. I think that she had devoted her whole life to inspiring women and girls and showing women and girls that they could, do things. But at the beginning of the movie, she has 2 teenage daughters in her tiny apartment with her, and OMG, they could use a little inspiration. In fact, the older one is sort of catatonic and, just doesn't speak, is crying, they've had a really hard time, and it shows, and you don't know what's exactly going on. But Lhakpa decides, and you don't even know when you first, I think, begin the movie, is like, is she delusional? Like, is she's like a middle-aged Whole Foods worker? Like, she wants to go and climb Mount Everest? Like, sure, Mom, And, but she decides that she's got to go back to her happy place and show them and inspire her girls. And so this is the setup.
So I want to ask you about that because, you shared an early rough cut with me. And when I received it, I thought, oh, this is a film about a woman who's climbing Mount Everest for the 10th time. But in that rough cut, I really recognized the connection with her daughters and felt like that was, as it becomes in the film, a really key part, like the emotional core of the film. And I wonder when you realize that in the course of making it?
Great question. Yeah. It's something that's fascinating about when you're making a documentary is often key scenes in the movie haven't happened yet. You don't even know they're going to happen. Right. It's not like you're planning them, just life hasn't happened yet when you start the edit. And the key sort of where things went stuff, especially with the daughters, just absolutely hadn't happened yet when we were editing even.
So just to set this up, you started to describe, she's got 2 teenage daughters. The older one, Sunny, when we first meet her in the weeks leading up to Lhakpa leaving for Nepal to do this climb, in the film, almost doesn't speak at all. She's suffered a lot of trauma in her life. We can say from an abusive ex-husband that Lhakpa had. I remember when I first saw her, I thought, well, lots of young people late in high school don't like to talk to their parents. And so there could be some of just that, a moody teenager, but there did seem to be something more going on. Then there's another daughter named Shiny, a couple of years younger, who is more open and is going to go to Nepal with her mom on at least part of the journey to go up to base camp. So Sunny, the older daughter, is not going to go. She's going to stay home, and Shiny, the younger daughter, is going to go. And later on, as you're describing now, other things happen, but there's growth in those relationships that you couldn't have understood at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that I did was persuade Shiny to come and really quite push her, because having been up there, I thought that would be great for her, not just for the movie, although of course I was really biased because I thought it'd be great for the movie.
A twofer.
But also because as a human being, I saw that it could be a real opportunity for her.
And how did Shiny, I think she was 15 at the time, how did she regard her mother or regard...
Yeah, absolutely. So she had this real arc. They both did. And, even when I perhaps shared that rough cut, I think we talked about it and you said you liked the kids' arcs. And I said, yeah, that's actually what came late in the editing room. I knew I wanted to shoot at Lhakpa on Everest, and I knew how to edit a movie with a mountain climb. I knew actually it's got a beginning, middle, and end. Mountain climbs are great to edit with, and they're also, of course, people like watching mountain climbs, which when you make documentaries, you love things that people want to watch because that helps.
You get a lot of added value visually.
Yeah, exactly. Super cinematic, super dramatic, super high stakes, and it just there are reasons why sports movies, mountain movies, they're just really classic narrative engines and really can be really good movies. And the kids, though, I hadn't quite seen yet that their arcs would be absolutely beautiful and really give dimension to Lhakpa's accomplishment and also measure Lhakpa's journey, because Lhakpa at the beginning of the movie wanted to inspire women and girls, and that had been her life's mission. And she sort of wanted to go back to Everest to reclaim her life's purpose. But what I hadn't seen at the beginning of the movie was that you could measure that in the inspiration that's experienced by her very own daughters. These are women and girls living right in this tiny apartment with her, and they are so visibly inspired, and they each have their individual stories. Shiny, the younger one, who I encouraged to come first to Kathmandu and then along to base camp, she...
How much resistance was there?
Oh, yeah, quite a bit. Yeah. Quite a bit. Oh, she had things to do. And she articulated very movingly, her embarrassment that she felt about living. She lives in a very wealthy Connecticut, very wealthy part of Connecticut. Her mom had, put them in this great school district, but the result of that was that all her neighbors were rich kids with big old houses. And she had this tiny apartment, and her mom working all these minimum wage jobs. And dad, who was sort of notorious, and that was a big legacy sort of to deal with. And I've never seen that narrative before. I've never seen the story of teenagers coping with a abusive parent who's been in the newspapers and is sort of and in the courts and has been labeled as a violent and abusive person. How do you relate to that? I don't think we see enough stories about families like that, honestly, because I think it is a lot for young people to manage, and that's what they were, up against. And so she has this tremendous arc where she, as many young people, don't really kind of understand the full accomplishments of their mom. And so she sort of just was sort of grumpy, as teenagers are, about, the sharing a bedroom with her mom and not having the things. And then she goes on this journey. And of course, when she's up on the mountain, Lhakpa smokes her. Her mom is so accomplished. Her mom is like the greatest of all time, female climber. And just even getting up to base camp is seriously demanding. There's this fantastic, teen moment we have in the movie where they're kind of having a kind of, mom-daughter correction, and Lhakpa was explaining to her that she feels the same, and she tries to really take a steady pace, same, but she pronounces it shame because of her accent. And of course, her teenage all American, too cool for mom daughter is like same, and shame. It's this great moment. So, and of course, Shiny, when she's up there on the mountain, especially when it got really tough because a storm came in, is understanding the extent of her mother's athleticism and courage and just grit in climbing Mount Everest. This is her 10th time doing it. And there's an avalanche, and Shiny is just sort of understanding quite what her mum is actually about. Sunny has a completely different arc. Sunny stays home, is very quiet, and through the story you can see there are different personalities that have reacted to the trauma of what they've been through in different ways. And Sunny's sort of more of an introvert and has taken a lot of this pain on herself. And there was this incredible moment when we were filming after Lhakpa had come home, and Sunny had been pretty resistant to filming. And I was honestly really terribly concerned about her, because I didn't think that we could release the movie if she wasn't in a strong enough place to cope with all that attention. And I was just flagging this constantly and trying to figure out what support we might be able to offer her. And it was a tremendous concern. And then one night we'd wrapped filming, and the door to her bedroom, where she'd been hiding out all day, opened. And she came into the kitchen wanting to eat with this kind of sort of much friendlier air than she'd had, and sort of just looking inspired. And I said, Sunny, how about we do a little filming? Because we hadn't done any for a while. And she said, sure. And so I said to the DP, quick, grab the camera, roll. And he said, no, I'm downloading the cards. We wrapped. And I was like, yeah, but this is
The moment.
Yeah, we're not wrapped. We're just about to roll. Like, let's put that card back in. Obviously, don't erase anything, but compared to anything else we shot today, this is more important. So he said, no, there's no lights. We sent the lights home. And I flicked on the kitchen lights. And I said,
There's a light.
There's a light. And he said, the sound recorders. Remember we said goodnight to the sound recorders half an hour ago? And I grabbed the boom pole, grabbed the Zoom recorder, because that was actually my equipment and not the sound recorders that we'd been using. And I said, I used to record sound. I know how to use these things. And so I became the sound recordist. And the DP, as we rolled, kept like turning to his face to me and mouthing like, this looks terrible. And I was like, it doesn't. It's fantastic, So we grabbed the scene, and it was this great moment in documentary filmmaking. When the moment happens, it's happening, right? And in this moment, Sunny had this extraordinary change. She was transformed. And she said to her mum, you going up that mountain, I felt like that accomplishment in myself. It was so many steps, and you did it. You took them all. You got to the top. And it was such a beautiful articulation of inspiration, that, I felt that accomplishment in myself. I felt that bright. And Sunny's very quiet, but you realize that she really speaks eloquently, and she's got this very powerful voice when she does speak. And it was this beautiful scene. And then Shiny, the younger one, says, look, we've never discussed what we've been through as a family. And they start to process. And the Sunny, the older one, says, do you remember when our dad did this? And he just sent me this. He died at this point a couple of years ago before, which was actually how we were able to make the movie. Because had he been alive, he would have been too threatening of a presence for us to be able to make the movie. Because he tragically was prone to extreme violence. He had knocked Lhakpa unconscious on Everest in front of journalists. He had put her in the hospital back in Connecticut. And it took a huge amount of courage for her to get away from him, because he was, saying that he was going to kill the girls and her. And so...
So when people watch this and think, what, like... she's such an incredible woman. How has it taken so long for her story to be told? This is a key part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think she could have told the story when George was alive. And I also think, why had nobody told this story before? I mean, I sort of felt like there was a recognition on my part. I know how to shoot on Everest. I'm a woman, and I really relate to what she's been through. I really relate to whole family set up in lots of different ways, actually, personally. And I always thought that was an important part of the story, precisely because I thought the story of a survivor of intimate partner violence, it was so powerful because she was obviously so strong. I mean, to climb Mount Everest 10 times, way more than any other woman ever in history. She's certifiably, one of the most strong and, resilient people ever. And yet her personal life could have brought her so low. What she'd been through in her personal life, she was still so vulnerable in her heart and in her home. In such challenged ways. And I thought, wow, if I can tell that story, I think that shows us so much about how tragically challenging it is to cope with these relationships when they get that difficult and that violent, and what it takes a woman to leave, and how vulnerable especially woman of color, poor immigrant woman who doesn't speak the language or read or write. There are so many women like that, but because they're not athletes or mountain climbers, we can't make a movie about them that people are going to watch. And we also can't point out to people so dramatically that this is a very, very strong person, and they still can't easily leave. And so I saw all that, and I could command this budget and had this very clear vision for how to make this movie, because I structured so many edits, and I love editing, and I also love doing these kind of giant jigsaw puzzles, which are these sort of character-driven narrative longitudinal films, the ones where you really see years of life compressed into a wonderful documentary, and so that you can sort of almost glimpse the machinery of life. It's like this fantastic, one of the things that just makes me tingle and thank my lucky stars I'm a documentary filmmaker is I don't know any other medium where you can kind of seem to peek right in. It's like the skin of life, and you see how life actually works. You see the forces that act on a life and nudge it in different directions. There are moments in this movie and in many of my movies where you can see the inflection point in a human life. And that is something I do not see in any other way. I think screenwriters look for those moments, but I don't want to make that up. I let life do the screenwriting. But you have to find, these things. And I'm just someone who loves, I'm relentless. I'm just don't take no for an answer very easily, and scoured the world for material so that I could find, really beautiful film and video of Lhakpa's life, because when she left her husband finally, she had no video or photos or indeed any possessions. She left that house with just her daughters, and she never got anything back. And she said, Lucy, I don't have any video and no photos, no home videos, nothing. And I sort of made this calculation, also knowing that there'd been this stuff filmed of her in 2000, that there must be stuff that was filmed of these expeditions or news over the years, and I just knew I could try to source all that stuff, and that would give us enough video that we could actually tell the whole of her life story. And I always had this idea in mind that it would be the Summits of Lhakpa Sherpa. It would be the story of her life, kind of that whole incredible journey that she'd been on, because it is the stuff of magical fairy tale. I mean, this is my kind of mythical hero right here, right? And hang that off the arc of the current day climb. And I personally didn't know, because of COVID, her dad had died, there'd been an avalanche. She hadn't actually climbed for a few years. So, in this point, she was turning 50, I believe, that year, right? So it's not obvious that she still had it, and that she could just kind of off the couch, leave Whole Foods and go summit Everest. I mean, I didn't know what was going to happen. Yeah, that was the plan. But you never know what's going to happen. A lot of people who set out to climb Mount Everest do not have a happy outcome. And so I knew that if we could get the climb and if I could get the archival footage, I knew that I was this filmmaker that loved to tell that story. And I thought, oh goodness, this is a story I know how to tell.
Before I wrap up, I do want to ask about the film's first screening at Toronto. I think you told me in advance Lhakpa's going to be watching it for the first time, which happens sometimes at a film festival. Is always a little extra nerve-wracking for the filmmaker for the subject to be watching it with an audience. But then when we were in the green room before the movie and you were talking to Lhakpa, she shared with you that this was the first time she was going to be seeing any movie. She'd never seen a movie before. And now she was going to the premiere of a film about her at a film festival. So what was that like for her? And I assume that Shiny and Sunny had also not seen the movie. Her
They hadn't seen the movie before either. I think it was really helpful that they didn't see the movie before Toronto, because I think it's sometimes really worrying, especially when people have been through experiences that have given them real shame and real anxiety about how they appear, when people have treated them really poorly. I think she shared so vulnerably, which is the strength of the movie. All my movies are only as good as the people in them have this just generosity of spirit that they're going to let people in, because the pain that they've been through can help other people. And yet it's so tender. And I knew that if she'd seen the movie before she saw the reaction of complete rapturous love and support and cheer, that it could be really frightening. Like, what are they going to think of me? she calls it her dirty raccoon life. She's hilarious and has all these like wonderful animals and like way of speaking English that's just all her own and just completely charming and delightful. But I think she'd have been very, very worried that, what did I say? What are they going to think? Are they going to, judge me more? But in fact, the just gorgeous response we got from that audience sort of carried her through that anxiety really beautifully. And the girls handled it incredibly well as well. And it was remarkable to learn that she hadn't. It was actually the night before because I wanted her to see a Q&A done by somebody else. So I always think the best way to not teach, but the best way for people to learn how to do a Q&A when they're in a movie and they haven't done it before is for them to just watch somebody else doing it. And then they could think, oh, that's what they did. Here's what I'm going to do. And so I wanted, and you had kindly actually
that's right, I forgot
given
this
us
detail.
tickets for Copa 71. I was really excited to see it because it's such a good movie. And I took her there and I sat her down. And she shared with me, that she'd never seen a movie before, not even on a screen. But of course, you realize being illiterate, even like working remote or seeing titles and credits, it's really hard. Plus, she was such a hard worker and she was supporting her family. She didn't really even sit down and have leisure time. And when she did, she wanted to be off out hiking. So we sat down. I'm super excited to show her the movie. It's a sports movie. It's a great movie. We're at Toronto. It's opening night. And then the movie opens and it's subtitled and she looks at me and I thought, oh God, here am I thinking I'm so sensitive to her being illiterate and it's a subtitled movie. And it's just one of those moments when you're humbled and you realize like, oh gosh, the world is so, people with disabilities, it's a bit like Sabria being blind, but like they're so capable that you kind of forget, what they're up against because they, make it look easy and it just isn't. So we had this incredible experience. And then we had this incredible experience at Toronto where they experienced this like just incredible ovation and just everyone, as I think the world now has fallen in love with Lhakpa because we just had our Netflix launch and we're just getting all this like love pouring in from around the world, including Nepal. It's the first film that Netflix has ever subtitled into Nepali, which is so just gratifying and that people even in that region where I think she especially wants to show people what women and girls are capable of, that the movie's going to be so accessible there to that community. It was really meaningful. So now the whole world I think is getting to know Lhakpa in all her true power, and the girls are also kind of continuing to go from strength to strength, and we've done these Q&As where they just speak so beautifully, and you could see that Lhakpa's climb inspired the family, healed the family, accomplished all her goals, and is now, as the movie is going out worldwide, it's just such an extension of her mission. It's really happy story.
I want to thank Lucy Walker for speaking with me. Her new film, Mountain Queen, The Summits of Lhakpa Sherpa, is now playing on Netflix. We have a new newsletter called Doc Voices, written by Anisha Javeri. You can find it by searching on Substack for Pure Nonfiction. If you want to advertise to our 40,000 readers, send an email to listen@purenonfiction.net. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan, partnership manager Bella Racklin, and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphaela Nehausen. I'm Thom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and visit our website at purenonfiction.net.